Phil has said some things that I think a lot of us who are committed to the tour and committed to the legacy of the tour have pushed back against. I think that some of his views on how the tour could be run and should be run, been a lot of disagreement there.
6 golf legends, one era that felt completely rigged. And if you think the hate in golf today is bad, wait until you hear what guys were saying behind closed doors back when the Big Three ruled everything. Someone literally called one of the greatest players who ever lived, he was T, and meant every word of it. Because that is what this era did to people. It broke them, it silenced them, it stole from them. And we are going to name every single name. Before we get into it, if this kind of deep golf history is your thing, go ahead and give this video some hype right now using the hype button below. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And trust us, this story deserves to be found. Now, before we go back to the 1960s and 1970s, we need to start right here in the present day, because what is happening in golf right now is not new. It is a rerun of something ugly that played out 60 years ago, and if you want to understand the depth of the hate that simmered under golf's so-called golden age, you first need to see what that same hate looks like when it boils over in the modern world, because it is boiling hard. Fred Couples, one of the most laid-back, beloved figures the sport has ever produced, stood up at a PGA Tour Champions breakfast in California and called Phil Mickelson a nutbag. Not quietly, not in private, in front of people. He mocked the reported $200 million that LIV Golf paid Mickelson at age 52. He said, "If you are giving Phil Mickelson $200 million at age 52 to shoot 74 and 75, God bless you." Couples said his problem was not personal, it was institutional. He spent 43 years building something on the PGA Tour, and watching Phil publicly bash that same tour felt like a betrayal he could not swallow. And that feud reignited again in 2025, when Mickelson called Couples a low-class jerk after Couples claimed Brooks Koepka wanted to return to the PGA Tour. These two men, who should have been old friends, are now enemies, over money, over loyalty, over who gets to control the narrative of the sport. Tiger Woods has described Mickelson's role as LIV Golf's lead recruiter as the ultimate betrayal. For Tiger, the PGA Tour's legacy is sacred. It was built on the commercial foundation that Palmer and Nicklaus constructed, and Mickelson was tearing at that foundation brick by brick. What was once a cold war of on-course rivalry became something deeper, an existential conflict over what golf even is and who it belongs to. Brandel Chambly went further than almost anyone. He called Mickelson a highly paid ventriloquist puppet involved in a sports washing operation. Those are not soft words. Those are words soaked in resentment and anger. And the reason those words exist, the reason this modern fury exists at all, is because golf has always had a small group at the top that controls everything. And when someone challenges that control, the reaction is volcanic. Here is the thing though. This hate did not start with LIV Golf. This hate did not start with Phil Mickelson. Golf has had this exact fight before. The faces were different, the money was different, but the structure was the same. A handful of men at the very top got everything. Television time, endorsement deals, appearance fees, world ranking influence, and the narrative of the sport itself. And the rest of the field, men who were every bit as talented and hardworking, got to watch from a distance and stay quiet about it. Most of them stayed quiet, but some of them did not. And their stories are what this video is about. To understand why so many elite pros in the 1960s and 1970s felt the game was rigged against them, you have to understand one man and one handshake. The man was Mark McCormick, a lawyer who saw something nobody else saw. He understood that television did not just want sports. It wanted icons. It wanted personalities so big and so recognizable that people would tune in just to watch them walk from the tee to the fairway. And in 1960, he shook hands with Arnold Palmer and changed professional golf forever. That handshake was the starting gun for what would become the International Management Group, or IMG. McCormick did not stop with Palmer. He signed Jack Nicklaus. He signed Gary Player. And with those three men under his roof, he had something no sports agent had ever had before. He had a closed loop, he controlled the top of the game. And once you control the top, you control everything below it. McCormick's firm, through its television arm called Trans World International, produced content that almost exclusively featured the Big Three. They created a show called Big Three Golf, broadcast on NBC and produced by Universal City Studios, that gave Palmer, Nicklaus, and Player massive purses and massive exposure that no other professional on tour could access. It was not just extra money, it was a separate economy that existed above the official PGA Tour earnings. An economy that only 3 men were allowed to enter. He also created an unofficial world ranking system that critics said was designed to benefit his own clients. If your ranking determined your tournament invitations, and the man who made the rankings also represented the men at the top of those rankings, what does that tell you? It tells you the game was not just played on the course. It was played in offices and television studios and boardrooms, and in those rooms only 3 men had a seat at the table. Chichi Rodriguez, who was no stranger to the realities of the tour, once said that an Arnold Palmer win added $100,000 to his own value. That line is often quoted as proof of how much Palmer lifted the whole sport. And that is true. The Big Three era grew golf into a global commercial machine. But Chichi's comment also reveals the other side of that truth. If Palmer winning added value, Palmer losing took it away. The entire financial health of the professional game was tied to 3 specific men. Everyone else was just along for the ride. And some of those men got very tired of riding. The system McCormick built required a very specific story. It needed 3 archetypes. The king, which was Palmer, the challenger, which was Nicklaus, and the internationalist, which was Player. That was the story. 3 men, 1 rivalry, 1 clean narrative for television to sell. There was no room for a 4th character. There was no room for nuance. And there was absolutely no room for someone who did not fit the archetype, no matter how many tournaments he won, no matter how many majors he claimed, and no matter how feared he was by the very men at the center of that story. So let us talk about the men who got left out. Let us talk about the legends who played through this era with elite talent, major trophies, and undeniable results, and still wound up treated like background actors in someone else's film. We are going to count them down, starting with number 6. But first, one more thing about the machine itself, because it is important to understand the full scale of what was being built here. McCormick did not just control television production and endorsement deals. He also designed courses and managed events through IMG, which meant that his clients were not only the most visible faces on television, they were built into the very structure of the events themselves. The courses were managed to ensure the Big Three were the primary draw. The starting times and the pairings that got the most favorable media attention skewed toward Palmer, Nicklaus, and Player. The entire ecosystem of professional golf in the 1960s and 1970s was, in some meaningful sense, an IMG product. And then there is the world ranking system. McCormick created the first unofficial world ranking in professional golf. Think about what that means. The man who managed the 3 men at the top of the sport also created the system that measured where everyone stood in the sport. Critics at the time said those rankings were designed to favor his clients in order to secure more invitations to major events and drive endorsement values higher. That suspicion never fully went away. And decades later, when LIV Golf struggled to earn world ranking points for its players, the original sin of McCormack's ranking system was still casting a shadow. The machinery he built in the 1960s was still running in the 2020s. That is how durable a rigged structure can be when it is built into the sport at its foundation. Now, the men who lived inside that structure and paid the price for it. Number 6. George Archer, Masters champion, consistently elite, commercially invisible. George Archer won the Masters tournament in 1969. Read that again. He put on the green jacket, he stood at Augusta National and held the trophy that every golfer on earth dreams about. And somehow, despite that achievement, he was consistently treated as what the research calls a workman compared to the big 3 stars. Not a champion, not a legend, a workman, someone who showed up, did the job, and was expected to disappear quietly while the real stars took their bows. Archer was not flashy. He was not the kind of personality that television executives dreamed about. He was steady, he was precise, he was elite by any honest measurement you care to apply. But the commercial machine that McCormick built did not run on precision and steadiness. It ran on charisma that could be packaged, promoted, and sold to a television audience that was just discovering golf. And George Archer, for all his ability, did not come in the right packaging. This is the part that should make every golf fan genuinely angry. Because what we are really talking about when we talk about George Archer is a system that decided greatness had a look, a sound, a personality profile. And if you did not match that profile, your wins did not count in the same way. Your major championship did not open the same doors. You could put on a green jacket and still be treated like you were lucky to be in the room. Think about the players the Big Three era told you to care about. Palmer charging up fairways with his sleeves rolled up. Nicklaus standing over putts with that absolute stillness. Player in his black shirt flying in from South Africa to remind everyone the game was global. Those were the images that got broadcast. Those were the faces that got sold to sponsors. And George Archer, winning the Masters in 1969, simply did not fit the visual that the machine had decided it needed. His was not a story the television producers were interested in developing, so they did not develop it. They cut away. They moved on. They found the next Nicklaus press conference or the next Palmer exhibition, and they left George Archer to celebrate in relative quiet. Archer's story is the clearest illustration of the era's core thesis. Greatness was not being discovered in the 1960s and 1970s. Greatness was being manufactured. It was being selected, shaped, packaged, and sold. And the men doing the selling decided who the product was going to be long before the tee shots were hit. For George Archer, that meant a career of excellence that the wider world never fully witnessed, because the wider world was only shown what McCormick and the television networks wanted them to see. A Masters title should be the beginning of a legend. For Archer, it was just another week that got swallowed by the machine. Number 5. Bob Goalby, Masters champion, still swallowed by someone else's story. If George Archer's story is about being ignored, Bob Goalby's story is about something crueler. He did not just get ignored. He won, and then had his moment stolen by a controversy that had nothing to do with how he played golf. Goalby won the 1968 Masters, the year before Archer. Back-to-back green jackets that the Big Three narrative simply absorbed and moved past without stopping to breathe. Goalby's win was tangled up in a scoring controversy involving Roberto De Vicenzo. De Vicenzo, through a heartbreaking administrative error involving an incorrect scorecard, was given a higher score than he actually shot. The rules required that the scorecard score stand, and so Goalby was declared the winner. It was legal, it was by the book, but it did not feel clean, and the media pounced on the controversy immediately. Here is what happened to Bob Goalby in the aftermath. The narrative did not celebrate him. The narrative mourned De Vicenzo. Every story written about that Masters became a story about a sad mistake rather than a deserved champion. And somewhere in all of that noise, Goalby's actual golf got buried. He had played the tournament. He had posted the score. He had earned the jacket. None of that mattered to a media machine that was far more interested in the drama of the controversy, and when the dust settled, far more interested in moving the spotlight back to Palmer and Nicklaus. Goalby later expressed the feeling that the Big Three narrative sucked the air out of his win. Think about what that means. You win the most prestigious major in golf, the one with the white tablecloths and the magnolias, and the history that makes grown men emotional. You win that, and the air still gets sucked out of it, because the machine was not built to celebrate you. The machine was built to celebrate 3 other men, and when someone outside the inner circle managed to sneak a win past them, the machine simply waited for the moment to pass and then got back to business as usual. The parallel to the modern era is striking. When a player today does something outside the established narrative, the system does not stop to honor it. It waits. It absorbs the moment, and then it goes back to promoting the men it has already decided are the story. That structural tendency did not begin with LIV Golf. It began in Augusta in 1968 with a man in a green jacket who should have been celebrated, but was instead left feeling like he had wandered into a party he was not invited to. Number 4. Dave Hill, the loudest voice in the room, the man who said what everyone else was only thinking. If Bob Goalby felt the injustice quietly and George Archer absorbed it professionally, Dave Hill refused to stay quiet about any of it. Hill was, by any honest measure of statistics, one of the most consistent players of his era. His results during certain periods trailed only Nicklaus and Casper in terms of sheer consistency, and yet he was treated as a peripheral figure, background noise, a name on a leaderboard that television cameras moved past on their way to find the Big Three. Hill's resentment was focused specifically on the belief that the system was designed to keep the Big Three on top, and that one of the main tools of that design was course setup. He believed loudly and publicly that the tour's leadership and the television networks were shaping conditions to favor power hitters, which was code for shaping conditions to favor Nicklaus and Palmer specifically. His most famous moment of defiance came at the 1970 United States Open at Hazeltine National. Hill criticized the course setup in terms that nobody who heard them has ever forgotten. He said the course was missing only 80 acres of corn and a few cows to be a farm. Those words got him fined. They also got him remembered, because what Hill was doing beyond the colorful language was making a serious structural argument. He was saying that the game's biggest stages were not neutral. They were not fair tests of golf. They were environments engineered to produce outcomes that the television companies and the marketing machine had already decided they wanted. Hill was not alone in this belief. He was just the one willing to say it out loud. And that willingness came at a cost. He was viewed as difficult, as a troublemaker, as someone who could not handle the competitive reality of the tour. But the men who called him those things were the same men who benefited most from the system he was criticizing. It is easy to call someone a complainer when the system is complaining about works in your favor. In the modern era, when Brandel Chamblee talks about obnoxious greed and ventriloquist puppets, he is doing something similar to what Dave Hill did 50 years ago. He is using public language to challenge a structure that most people inside it do not want challenged. The difference is that Chamblee is directing his criticism at someone he sees as attacking the establishment, while Hill was attacking the establishment itself. But the energy is the same. The fury is the same. And the source of that fury, the belief that money and power are concentrated in ways that distort the sport's integrity, has not changed one bit. Number 3. Tom Weiskopf, the man with the most beautiful swing in golf and the heaviest psychological burden. Not all of the resentment in this era was loud. Not all of it came out in press conferences and published critiques. Some of it lived inside a man quietly and ate at him year after year until the damage was done. Tom Weiskopf carried that kind of resentment. His was not the fury of Dave Hill or the defiance of Lee Trevino. His was something quieter and in many ways harder to watch. Weiskopf possessed what many people in the sport considered the most aesthetically beautiful swing of the 1970s. He had physical talent that should have translated into a career of multiple major championships. He was long, he was elegant, he was precise when he was at his best, but he was also haunted. He finished as runner-up at the Masters tournament 4 times. 4 times. He stood on the doorstep of the most celebrated major in golf on 4 separate occasions and came away empty each time. And all 4 of those times, Jack Nicklaus was in the story. That is not a coincidence you can simply attribute to the random nature of sport. Nicklaus was not just beating Weiskopf physically, he was beating him in ways that went deeper than golf shots. The Big Three era had spent years promoting Nicklaus as something beyond human, a golfing mind so superior that other players could not fully comprehend it. And Weiskopf, to some degree, internalized that promotion. He began to believe the story. His most revealing quote came when someone asked him what was going through Nicklaus's mind during a high-pressure moment. Weiskopf replied that if he had any idea what was going on in Jack's mind, he would have won the tournament 3 or 4 times himself. Read that carefully. He is not just paying a compliment to a rival, he is confessing that the psychological gap between them felt unbridgeable, that he could not access whatever mental space Nicklaus occupied. And part of the reason he felt that gap so acutely was because the entire industry surrounding the sport had spent years telling him it existed. The Big Three era did not just market 3 men as the best players in the world, it marketed them as a different category of human being, as gods of the game. And when you grow up inside a sport that tells you repeatedly that certain men are simply on a different level, that message gets into your head. It becomes part of how you see a leaderboard, part of how you feel walking to the first tee on Sunday with a chance to win. It becomes the voice in the back of your mind that asks whether you really belong there, whether you really have what it takes to beat the men the whole world has been told are unbeatable. It got into Weiskopf's head. His volatility on the course, his struggles with consistency and composure in big moments, were symptoms of a man trying to reconcile genuine physical talent with a narrative that had already decided he was not the hero of the story. He had the swing, he had the length, he had the short game to compete at the highest level, but he was fighting the story every single time. And the story had been written by men with television studios and marketing budgets, and a commercial interest in making sure the outcome was already decided before the final round began. The tragedy of Tom Weiskopf is that he may have been good enough to win those Masters. He may have had the game, but the game operates inside a mind, and the mind was working against him every single time he got close. The Big Three era manufactured that mental barrier, and Weiskopf paid the price for it for his entire career. Number 2, Lee Trevino, the man who refused to play by anyone else's rules. Where Weiskopf's resentment turned inward, Lee Trevino's exploded outward. Trevino did not absorb the establishment story. He refused it completely. He looked at the world that the Big Three and their commercial machine had built, and he essentially said, I am not interested in belonging to that. I am going to do this my way, on my terms, and I am going to beat you while I am doing it. Trevino rose from genuine poverty. He started as a hustler, a club professional, a man who learned the game in conditions that were about as far from Augusta National as it is possible to get. And when he arrived on the PGA Tour and encountered the world of Palmer and Nicklaus and Player, he did not see a meritocracy. He saw an elitist, upper-crust establishment that had very clear ideas about who was welcome and who was not. His most famous act of defiance was his recurring boycott of the Masters tournament. Palmer and Nicklaus were the kings of Augusta. Weiskopf went there 4 times in search of a crown he could never claim, but Trevino largely chose not to go at all. He felt fundamentally unwelcome at a club that he described as having a history of blatantly racist policies. His discomfort was so deep and so personal that when he did appear at Augusta, he reportedly changed his shoes in the parking lot to avoid entering the clubhouse or locker room. That is not a man who is merely uncomfortable. That is a man who is making a statement with every choice he makes about where he stands and where he refuses to stand. Trevino's resentment toward the Big Three era went beyond Augusta. He complained that the tour's most prestigious venues and its most celebrated traditions were built around the power-hitting games of Nicklaus and Palmer. He raised issues about everything from how caddies were treated to how many tickets players received. He saw these things not as minor administrative decisions, but as signals. Deliberate signals about who truly belonged in the sport's elite spaces and who was just being tolerated. His most extraordinary act of competitive defiance came at the 1972 Open Championship. That year, Nicklaus was attempting a run at the Grand Slam. He had already won the Masters and the United States Open. The Open Championship at Muirfield was the third leg, and Trevino, in a display of chipping that defied belief, chipped in repeatedly to deny Nicklaus the leg he needed. After it was over, Trevino declared himself the greatest chipper in the world. It was not a modest statement. It was not polite. It was exactly the kind of loud, pointed, unapologetic assertion that the Big Three's corporate-friendly presentation never allowed for. Trevino used his mouth and his mind and his hunger as weapons. He saw the Big Three not simply as competitors, but as a wall. And he climbed that wall using a kind of raw, deprived hunger that men who grew up comfortable and celebrated simply did not have access to. His famous prayer that he would not be invited back to Augusta was not a joke. It was a rejection of the Big Three's home territory and everything it represented in terms of who was allowed to define what golf meant and who the sport's heroes were supposed to be. Trevino wrote his own story, not because the machine gave him permission, but because he refused to ask for it. Number 1, Billy Casper, the ghost in the statistics, the forgotten man. And now we arrive at the most jaw-dropping injustice of the entire era. Because if you look at the actual numbers, if you strip away the marketing and the television shows and the IMG narrative, and just look at what players did on golf courses, there is an argument to be made that the biggest star of the Big Three era was not any member of the Big Three. Between 1956 and 1975, Billy Casper won 51 PGA Tour titles and 3 major championships, including 2 United States Opens. 51 wins. Stop and sit with that number for a second. Gary Player, one of the Big Three, one of the men whose face was on television every week and whose name was synonymous with the Golden Age, won 24 PGA Tour titles. Less than half of what Casper accumulated. Palmer won 62. Nicklaus won 73 over a much longer career. But Casper won 51, which is more than Player and more than enough to build a legend around if the machine had wanted to build one. It did not. That is not a supporting role. That is a leading man's resume. And yet Casper was so thoroughly erased from the era's commercial story that he became known by a nickname that says everything about what happened to him. He was called the Forgotten Man. Here is the thing that should shake you. Jack Nicklaus, who had every reason in the world to downplay other great players of his era, said publicly that Casper was the player he feared the most. The player he feared the most. Not Palmer, not Player, not Trevino. Billy Casper. The man the marketing machine decided was not worth selling. Why was Casper not part of the Big Three? The research is very clear on this. The IMG narrative required exactly 3 archetypes: the king, the challenger, and the internationalist. That was the product. That was the show. A Big Four was considered less marketable, and Casper, a reserved family man whose game was built on a methodical and brilliant putting stroke rather than the aggressive, swashbuckling style that Palmer used to thrill crowds, was deemed less televisual, less exciting, less sellable. So he was left out, not because he was not good enough, because he was not the right shape for the box the marketers had already built. The financial consequences of this decision were real and lasting. The endorsement income and the appearance fees that flowed to the Big Three through IMG's various television productions and made-for-TV events simply did not flow to Casper. He played in the same era. He won more often than Gary Player. He beat Nicklaus's most feared rival in Nicklaus's own estimation, and he still got paid like a secondary character. The psychological weight of this exclusion comes into focus most clearly when you look at what happened at the 1966 United States Open at the Olympic Club. Casper came from 7 shots back to defeat Arnold Palmer in a playoff. 7 shots. That is one of the greatest comebacks in major championship history. He won. He genuinely, fairly, completely won. And the story that emerged was not about Casper's brilliance. The story was about Palmer's collapse. The narrative of the sport's greatest icon faltering was simply more interesting to the media than the story of the forgotten man rising. So that is the story they told. Casper later expressed regret about a remark he made to Palmer following the win. He called it a smart-ass remark and said he carried the guilt of it for decades. Think about that. The man won one of the greatest comeback victories in American golf history and came away from it feeling guilty. Not celebrated, not elevated. Guilty. Because even in his greatest moment of triumph, the pressure of being an outsider to the Big Three story had gotten inside him and poisoned the experience from within. Now, let us take a breath and look at what all 6 of these men have in common. George Archer won a green jacket and was called a workman. Bob Goalby won a green jacket and had his moment replaced by a controversy narrative. Dave Hill matched the era's best in consistency and was fined for telling the truth. Tom Weiskopf had the talent to win multiple majors and was psychologically undermined by a narrative that said he was not the right man. Lee Trevino had the hunger and the skill to beat anyone and still found himself changing shoes in parking lots. Billy Casper won 51 times and was called the forgotten man by an industry that Nicklaus privately admitted he feared more than anyone else. This is what a rigged system does. It does not prevent talent from performing. It prevents talent from being seen. It controls the camera. It controls the story. And when the story has already been written, even the most extraordinary achievements struggle to find an audience. Now bring that back to today, because the system the Big Three era built did not die with the 1970s. It evolved. It grew. It became the PGA Tour in its modern form, with its television deals and its legacy narrative and its sense of sacred institutional history. And when Phil Mickelson decided that the system was rigged against players in a new way, when he looked at the media rights deals and the treatment of players and said the greed was obnoxious, the reaction from inside the establishment was volcanic. Tiger Woods, who is the establishment now in a way that Palmer was in his day, called it the ultimate betrayal. Fred Couples, who gave 43 years to the tour, called Mickelson a nutbag. Brandel Chambly used language that would have made Dave Hill nod in recognition because Chambly was doing exactly what the establishment always does when someone challenges its authority from outside. It attacks, it labels, it makes the challenger the villain. Pat Perez said, Mickelson crossed a line that is uncrossable and unforgivable. Hal Sutton, who has never forgiven Phil for blaming him publicly for the 2004 Ryder Cup loss, fired back about selfishness and a lack of accountability. Billy Walters alleged that Mickelson's refusal to testify at an insider trading trial cost Walters his freedom, and that Mickelson had wagered $400,000 on the United States Ryder Cup team in 2012 while playing in it. Even Vijay Singh, a fellow major champion, ended up in a physical confrontation with Mickelson in the Augusta Champions locker room over a rules dispute, a moment later confirmed by Tiger's caddy Steve Williams, who said there is no love lost between those two. These are not the conflicts of a sport at peace with itself. These are the conflicts of a sport that has always concentrated its rewards at the very top and watched resentment build among those who felt excluded from that concentration. When money and spotlight get concentrated, hate is guaranteed. That is the lesson of the Big Three era. That is the lesson of the modern PGA Tour versus LIV conflict. And it is a lesson that keeps repeating because the sport, for all of its growth and all of its evolution, has never fully solved the structural problem at its center. The Big Three era proved that in professional sports, greatness is a resource that gets manufactured, managed, and fiercely protected. The golden era was not golden for everyone. For every Palmer striding up the fairway with the galleries following and the cameras rolling, there was a Billy Casper walking the same fairways with 51 wins and no spotlight. For every Nicklaus receiving the credit that the establishment decided he deserved, there was a Tom Weiskopf fighting battles inside his own mind that the marketing machine had helped create. But here's where we land. Here is what matters. The sport is bigger now than it has ever been. More people play golf, more people watch golf, more people care about the history of golf. And that growth happened in part because of what the Big Three era built, with all of its unfairness and all of its commercial ruthlessness. The machine worked. It brought golf to the world. What the sport owes now is the honesty to look back at that era with clear eyes. To acknowledge that alongside the glamour and the rivalry and the golden moments, there were men who paid a real price. Casper lost income and recognition he deserved. Trevino fought doors that should never have been closed to him. Weiskopf carried a psychological weight that was partly placed on him by an industry that could have been kinder. Hill told the truth and got fined for it. Goalby won a major and felt his moment evaporate. Archer won a major and was called a workman. These men deserve better from the sport's history. They deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to the Big Three story, but as legends in their own right. Because that is what they were, legends. Men who brought extraordinary ability to one of the hardest games ever invented and performed at its highest level during one of its most competitive eras. Men who showed up every single week and gave everything they had, even when the system gave them nothing back in return. Golf is bigger when it remembers everyone, not just the chosen few, not just the men the machine decided to promote. Every golfer who ever battled a fairway, faced a pressure putt, and found a way to put the ball in the hole deserves a place in the story. And the 6 men in this video earned that place many times over. They just never got to hear it said. Often enough, Archer the workman, Goalby the overlooked champion, Hill the loudest truth teller, Weiskopf the perfectionist who carried a weight that was never fully his to carry, Trevino the insurgent who changed his shoes in parking lots, and then went out and beat everybody. Casper, the forgotten man who was feared more than anyone by the man who supposedly had no equal. 6 legends, 1 rigged era. A story that golf owes itself. If you made it this far, you clearly love the deep stuff. Drop a comment below and tell us which of these 6 legends you think got robbed the most by the Big Three era. Was it the forgotten man, the insurgent, the perfectionist, the loudest critic, the Masters winners who still got nothing in return? Let us know. And if you want more videos like this one, hit like and subscribe because we are just getting started.